I think that the biggest learning right off the bat is just that there's no such thing as joining a new company and running the exact same plays and expecting the same results. One of the things that I think a lot about just in general is removing friction from the buying process.
Hey, Melissa, I am so excited to have you here. You are a OG POCUS community member and customer and product-led sales evangelist. And I think it's almost been 2.5 years now, or 3 years that we've known each other. So I'm pumped to have you on the podcast. But before we dive in, tell us who you are, where you work, what's your background?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Alexa. Super stoked to be here. And can't believe it's been that long. We've been on this journey together. So my name is Melissa. I'm the head of product-led sales at a company called Clockwise. And for those that aren't familiar, Clockwise is an AI-powered calendar solution that optimizes team schedules to simplify scheduling and create more time in the workday. And as far as my background, I've been in sales for a little over a decade. Started my career making 80 cold calls a day. And while I was able to make that work, I definitely felt pretty early on like there was a mismatch between how I was being told to sell and how people actually like to buy. So that reflection actually led me to LinkedIn, where I was on the early sales team for Sales Navigator and kind of pioneering social selling. And then I realized I was ultimately drawn to this seemingly universal truth, which is that people want to try something before they buy it, which is what led me to the product-led world of Asana and now a couple years of Clockwise.
Amazing. I love that story. And it's cool that you were kind of living in this PLS world before it was even coined, and all very good products. I love Clockwise and Asana and LinkedIn. So you've just crushed it with all of the companies you've worked at. Maybe where we can start is, so you were in 2 different PLS roles. First, well, it was LinkedIn, then Asana, then Clockwise. I'd be curious, any learnings that you had at Asana that you brought to Clockwise, and what looked different, what looked similar?
For sure. I think that the biggest learning right off the bat is just that there's no such thing as joining a new company and running the exact same plays and expecting the same results. Every company is a little bit different, even if the buyer is the same, even if other things about it look similar. Those differences just always exist at every company. So I think the biggest thing that I have taken with me from role to role and would continue to do so, staying in the product-led world, would be some of the foundational knowledge and beliefs that I think are so core to being successful in product-led sales. So things like being extremely user-centric and really trying to understand the challenges that your users are trying to solve by hiring your product. Along with that, being a little bit product obsessed, maybe more than the average salesperson. I'm still a salesperson. That's still where I hang my hat. But getting into the weeds and understanding how real people are actually experiencing and engaging with your product should directly influence how you're talking to them. And then last but not least is just knowing that product-led sales can be a bit of a long game. A lot of product-led tools lend themselves to this kind of land and expand type of motion. So making sure that customers and users are successful before they even start paying you will pay dividends through the rest of their journey. But as a traditional or tops down seller, that might be a tough pill to swallow if you're working with a customer that could be big, but they want to start small. So just kind of taking that into consideration, I think would be beneficial no matter where you go.
Those are all super good insights. I also remember vividly first when we were talking about just what even is product-led sales before there was a big community around it. Something you talked about is that user-centric, product-obsessed mindset, and how that is something I think that kind of folks that work in sales at PLG companies can bond over, that it's, you have the core in you are great at sales, building relationships, but it really is knowing your product inside out and knowing how the user, empathizing with the users to make sure you understand their experience, what drives them, where they're getting value. So I think that's a really, really good call out.
Yeah. Totally. And I'm also personally drawn to tools that I myself am a user of. So that's not necessarily every like dev tool out there, but LinkedIn, Asana, Clockwise, all things that I feel benefit my day to day. So kind of having that user hat on myself, I think is super beneficial when talking to customers.
Totally. I definitely can see that when talking to you, even when we're like jamming on things clockwise related. You know everything about the product. You've even pinging us, being like, "You want to beta test this part?" I'm like, "You're in sales, but you're doing some product work," which I love. Something else that has been enjoyable working with you is thinking through different product-led sales playbooks to run. And I think you did an excellent job of figuring out what are these playbooks we should run, and kind of thinking about what it might look differently for each role. Can you tell me a little bit about what your go-to sales playbooks are and how it's evolved at Clockwise?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of keeping that product hat on a little bit. One of the things that I think a lot about just in general is removing friction from the buying process. So, I mean, yes, in a product perspective, there's a time and place for good friction, but I do not think that time or place is when people are trying to pay you. So when I first started actually at both Asana and Clockwise, both products had implemented a seat minimum on self-serve. And it's fairly easy to understand why on a surface level, right? The products are best used by teams. And you want to protect your downside on your ACV, absolutely. But there was demand for these smaller teams to upgrade and to pay. And so figuring out the right packaging for each product looked a little bit different. But safe to say, neither one of them is turning away that revenue now. And so if it's a tiny company, you can just kind of let self-serve and let the product do the heavy lifting for you there. I'm not suggesting putting sales resources against that, but those smaller purchases might exist within much larger organizations. Could be great logos that are just paying you, a small amount to start. So that can be a great foot in the door for future expansion. So that's, I'd say, one of the plays that I would pretty much always recommend a team start to implement. Another one that I think pretty much any company, not even just product-led companies, can benefit from is really deeply understanding and analyzing your hand raisers. So understand who is proactively coming to you, what do they have in common from a firmographic, demographic standpoint, but also the problem that they're looking to solve. And then that's going to be your first big clue as to what your PLS or outbound motion might look like, because you can start pattern matching to find more companies and more people like those that are finding you.
That's awesome. I love that. And sometimes people overcomplicate playbooks, and I like how you've simplified them. And it's sometimes the most obvious ones, like hand raisers, are the most impactful and efficient. And having like a really tight motion around that can go a really long way. Something that's interesting about Clockwise, as well as like many other PLG companies, is you are a horizontal product. So I know that you target engineering teams, but I use Clockwise and I'm a founder, and our sales and marketing team use Clockwise. And you definitely have other teams that are not just engineering using Clockwise. Perfect. So how do you think about building like different playbooks and different motions for different segments?
For sure. And like you kind of just said, you don't need to overcomplicate it necessarily. You can be a tool that anyone can use, but it's likely, maybe not a guarantee, but likely that there are pockets where you are more successful than others. So obviously you don't try to sell to every single user that signs up unless you somehow have a sales team that can do that. But odds are you don't. So really the most important thing is, as a prerequisite anyway, understanding who uses your product, but then also who pays for your product. And so ideally, I think you're asking for that data when folks sign up for your tool, if it is a self-serve PLG tool, before anyone says, no, I don't want to add friction to my onboarding process. What I've found is that typically asking questions that people feel like will be used for their benefit, used to enhance their product experience, even if it doesn't right away, are generally not harmful to things like onboarding completion rate. So understanding who your users are and then who your buyers are. And then from there, it kind of goes back to what I was saying too about hand raisers. So figuring out who actually pays for your product. Like you said, we could have users across in every department in a business, and that's great. We're happy to have them. But for Clockwise anyway, one or two departments typically stand out as the highest density, biggest volume, and also highest willingness and likelihood to pay. And that's generally correlated with how much value they extract from the product. Clockwise can do a lot of different things, and some are more valuable than others, and some correlate with higher willingness to pay than others. So yes, as you noted, we do have a lot of success with engineering teams, particularly because we think a lot about focus time and schedule optimization, and engineers are willing to pay to improve that, more so we found than other functions. In sales, we're not really batting an eye if we're in meetings all day, because that's kind of what we expect. But engineers often feel a little bit differently. So yeah, you don't need to overcomplicate it, and just know where you're most likely to win. And then you can still be opportunistic, going after other groups, other logos. You want to be pushing the envelope, but don't need to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Something that stood out to me, what you just said, is around friction, where you said earlier you don't want to add friction to the payment process, which is obvious, but it is okay to add friction earlier in the journey. And I think that's a great call out, because it helps both you and the customer. A, they're getting a more personalized experience, and B, it helps you understand kind of more, like you said, doing the analysis, doing the segmentation, and understanding where you should spend time. So I like the kind of juxtaposition of talking about you don't want friction later in the sales cycle, but you want it earlier, which is a cool call out. And going on the theme of kind of experimenting, analyzing, I know you all have done a lot of experimentation and figuring out what playbooks work and what don't, and figuring out that hand raisers, for example, is something that works well. How do you think about that, and how often do you want to be experimenting with playbooks?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to playbooks and trying new things, we like to say, nail it, then scale it. So in my role, I essentially own a portfolio of different experiments and plays, almost like a little incubator within our sales team. And so we're always starting with a hypothesis. Who should we be reaching out to, and why? What do we think reaching out to these folks will help them do, help us do, bridge that gap? And then we scope the audience and understand what's going to be the volume of new users or new organizations that are meeting this targeted criteria on an ongoing basis. And then we come up with the actual tactical execution of what are we going to be saying to these people, and why. And then, of course, setting up things like dashboards to monitor KPIs like reply rate and operation rate. And then from there, this is where POCUS comes in handy. It's super easy to kind of orchestrate this all from within POCUS, setting up that audience, setting up that targeting criteria, and then even taking it through to the next step of figuring out what outreach sequence you're going to be adding these folks to. That is your tool of choice. And then once we have some early data on whether or not we think this is something that we want to continue doing, and kind of formalize it a little bit more, that's when I would loop in our RevOps team to architect it on the Salesforce side of things. So things like lead creation and lead routing. So when we say nail it, then scale it, that generally means I'm doing some of the initial testing, initial outreach, initial design. But then once we find success with something, that's when we're scaling it to the rest of our sales team, which is still relatively small. And on the flip side, though, it's always super valuable to know when a play isn't working out. And so having those dashboards and KPIs set up and having this kind of framework ahead of time can also tell you when it's appropriate to say pull the plug. And it can be hard for me to do that especially when I feel like something was such a good idea and this ought to have worked. Why didn't it work? But it can be helpful to know, when to table it for now, and it still means you can pick it up again later. But it's really helpful to have this kind of framework when you're thinking about prioritizing the limited time, energy, and resources that many of our teams have today.
I am for sure stealing the nail it, then scale it. That is incredible. And it is so important with product-led sales. You need to figure out how to get it right first before you roll it out to the entire org.
Yeah, I didn't come up with it, so I can't take credit, but I also don't remember where I heard it, so I can't appropriately give credit.
We can credit you, Melissa. All good. We'll credit you. You're now the creator of that that saying. I love it. And I also think there's something important of like not throwing away playbooks that don't work. It's almost as powerful as leaning into the ones that do, and not having that mindset of like sunk cost fallacy of, but we've been putting so much effort into it and trying it, and you just got to say goodbye to some playbooks sometimes.
Yeah, nothing's too precious, right? And that's what I always tell new hires too, when a new person joins the team, regardless of if they're joining the sales team or any part of the company. If you have an early one-on-one, they're like, hey, any advice as I onboard? I always say, especially at a startup, don't assume anything is too precious. It's possible that the way something was very deliberately designed. We thought about every possible way that something could be done and then tested them all and then picked this one as the best one. Or it's possible that someone just decided one day, this is how we're going to do something, did no testing, and now we live with it. So don't assume that anything is totally set in stone, because it's just so rare that that's actually the case.
You just have all these fire sayings that I'm going to absolutely copy after this podcast. That is so important. And I think even not just for startups, like at every stage of the journey, there's something that was implemented, but you grow out of it or you scale out of it, and there needs to be a whole new set of playbooks. So it's not something that you're ever going to set in stone unless you're like Oracle and know exactly what's working. Every early stage company that is growing quickly and changing daily, weekly, monthly needs to be having this mindset. So I'm crediting you, Melissa, with all of these incredible sayings, but will be stealing them. My last question for you is, I think something really cool is you were very early at Clockwise. So one of the first people on the go-to-market team, and you really helped build the product-led sales motion from scratch. And I get a lot of people asking me in the community, like, how do you do this? So maybe looking back to Melissa years ago, what's one piece of advice you'd give yourself or someone else who's building PLS from scratch?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is ever evolving. But I think one of the things one piece of advice that I would give someone starting out from scratch and building PLS is that I mentioned earlier, it can be a long game, but even more than that, it can feel like you're competing against yourself. So your sales team might lose a deal when a customer decides, hey, we love your free product and that's good enough for us now. We don't need to pay for this today. And as a salesperson, obviously that hurts. It is your job to get revenue from these customers. So it feels like a failure. But as far as advice goes, I would say you truly haven't lost that deal until they wholesale go with a competitor and start paying someone else. So as long as they are staying within your ecosystem, you haven't lost yet.
That's a great one. And it's a very common thing that I hear from a lot of sellers of PLG companies, and definitely a different mindset than a traditional sales org. So I really appreciate these insights.
It still feels really bad. Every sales needs to hear, we love your product.
Oh, yeah.
Don't want to pay for it. You're like, how do those two things go together? But just know that that's often a not right now, not a no forever.
Yeah, it's a great point. And this could open up a whole other 30-minute podcast on how to not cannibalize the self-serve motion with sales and how do you balance the two. But I think it is very difficult to figure out kind of when you should be happy if someone says, we want the free or self-serve version for now, and putting on your early stage employee hat of this is benefiting the company and we will get the sale later, when it really means that, they're ready to pay and ready to get extra value from the product.
Yeah. And we didn't even spend time on this session talking much about product feedback and how important that is, especially in the early stages. sales team being really any customer facing team, but being the eyes and ears of the product team. Product team hopefully is talking to customers, but no one's doing it more than those on the front lines. So yeah, that's a whole nother podcast as well. Is like,
I'm going to ask you one. I lied. I'm going to ask you one more question then, because I think you've done a very good job of working with product and funneling feedback. Like, what has made you successful at that, and how did you figure that out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I do this just in my life in general, which is just like not necessarily taking what people say, and in this case, what customers or users say at face value, and really trying to peel a couple layers back and understand what are they actually trying to achieve, and what are they trying to do? Because you'll get a lot of really half-baked product feedback, and it's really just someone had a random idea and they shot it to you via email, and like that's all well and good. That's totally fine. But I think pushing them, the user, to think a little bit more critically about that before you just punt it all over to your product team who says, what am I supposed to do with this? Can help a lot in building trust in that relationship and also getting stuff that you want built.
Totally. I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Melissa. We covered a lot of topics in a short amount of time. So I really appreciate all of your incredible insights and learnings. And for you now, customer, community member, evangelist, and now podcast guest. So we are so thankful that you were with us today. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. It was great catching up.